Welcome to today's episode of EV Hub Live, a live video podcast for public policy professionals working to advance transportation electrification. EV Hub Live is recorded live, so to tune in, ask questions, and check the schedule, please visit atlasevhub.com/live. On today's episode, we'll hear from the Natural Resources Defense Council's Jordan Brinn about what it will take to build out a sustainable electric vehicle battery supply chain. Jordan is an expert on transportation electrification policy at NRDC and author of a recent report called Building Batteries Better, Doing the Best with Less. Here's your host, Atlas Public Policy's founder, Nick Nigro.
All right. Welcome back to EV Hub Live, everybody. My name's Nick Nigro, and I'm your host. Today, we're going to talk batteries, recycling, and all the things that go along with that. Before we get into the interview or my interview with Jordan, I'd like to bring on John from Atlas Public Policy to give us some context on what we're talking about today. John, take it away.
Thanks, Nick. So as part of the EV Acceleration Challenge, the Biden administration is aiming for 50% of all new vehicle sales in the U.S. to be electric by 2030. The DOE and the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, that could mean between 30 to 42 million EVs on the road by 2030. All of those EVs are going to rely on batteries to power them, and those batteries rely on the extraction of critical minerals commonly used in many technologies today. With these minerals becoming increasingly scarce as their use expands over time, the U.S. needs to find a way to keep up with the rapidly increasing demand for EVs. One potential solution to this problem is developing a circular economy. The U.S. will be facing the retirement of up to 400,000 metric tons worth of EV batteries by 2030, with that figure only expected to rise as more EVs hit the end of their expected lifespan. That's a lot of minerals. A big question is, how can the U.S. manufacture the needed EV batteries without sacrificing adverse environmental impacts, environmental justice issues, and risking national security by increasing reliance on foreign adversaries? According to Jordan Brinn, a transportation expert from the NRDC, the U.S. needs to approach the situation by addressing the entire life cycle of EV batteries, from mineral extraction to technological advancement to recycling and reuse of these materials. In her recent report, she explores the current landscape and how the U.S. can build a sustainable EV battery market for the future. Nick, back to you.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. Let's bring on Jordan now. Jordan, welcome to the show. Really appreciate you joining us. You wrote a fabulous report released just recently for the NRDC, where you get into all the details about batteries. I'm constantly reminded with how quickly this industry is evolving. Just a few short years ago, we were just talking about hoping to get consumer sales and consumer interest in EVs. And now a big focus of this industry is on scale, and batteries are a huge part of that. And so I'd like to start our conversation with talking about resource extraction. This is also something relatively new to a lot of us in the EV space. It's also kind of ironic or interesting, or however you want to look at it, that the NRDC has to talk about resource extraction in a way that encourages some amount of it, of course, to get these batteries into consumers' hands and into vehicles around the country and around the world. So let's start with that. Tell me about what that's like for you at the NRDC, working at an environmental NGO and having to focus on resource extraction. What are some of the things you've been focusing on in this report? Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Nick. Thanks for having me today. Excited to talk about these issues. Where I think I like to start is the idea that our current fossil fuel system also relies on extraction. So it's not necessarily a new issue that we've focused on this idea of extraction, but it is a little bit of a new issue, right? That we're focusing on, okay, actually, we do need a little bit of extraction. So in the process of writing my report, I worked a lot with my colleagues throughout NRDC that have worked on a myriad of things. And some of the colleagues I worked really closely with are the folks that have traditionally worked on mineral extraction and oil and gas extraction on federal land. So they really helped me develop that portion of the report and our recommendations here. And no system is going to have zero impact, but what's pretty clear to me is that our current fossil fuel system is not the answer. what is the answer is a combination of making sure that we're electrifying our vehicles and then also making sure that we're using as little as minerals as possible to do so, and also making sure we're getting those minerals out of the ground with the least amount of impact possible. That's how we'll get to a closer to zero impact system. It will never be perfect, and I think that we have to acknowledge that. But what we also have to think about is that it's not just EV battery mining or no mining. It's EV battery mining that we can really clean up and also reuse those minerals again and again, or it's our current linear fossil fuel system that is going to always require input of extracted materials.
Yeah, that's really good summary of what some of the challenges I think in the environmental community faces in talking about EVs and balancing that with what's necessary from in order to continue to protect the environment as we electrify more of it. You brought up big oil or oil companies in general. There's been a movement from some of those companies in trying to get into batteries. In fact, some of them are trying to make some investments in mineral extraction now in the United States. What do you all see as the role of big oil here? Are they just going to become the new miners and the quote unquote potentially new enemy for the environmental movement, or are they a potential ally here? Could you talk a little bit about how you see them, their role playing out as we start to expand more batteries?
Sure. So there's not like a ton of really solid overlap between oil and gas companies in terms of like operations and expertise when it comes to mineral mining. What I think we want to focus on is to make sure that there are standards in place, both on the side of mining minerals and then also throughout the supply chain for processing those minerals, for manufacturing the batteries and recycling those minerals, so that no matter who is involved, they are being monitored and that they have to make sure that they're employing methods that would lower the impacts and make sure they're protecting the communities and the environments that their facilities are in. So I think that's the end we're focused on a little more. If oil, I don't know, if they want to invest cash in the workforce development and the expertise development to be involved, I think we just want to make sure that no matter who's involved, that they'll have to adhere to strong standards. And that
there's no doubt that companies in the oil and gas industry have tremendous engineering capacity and talent there. And I guess the question is, can those talents be reprioritized and done and taken advantage of in such a way that they actually are going to help drive down the use of their primary source of revenue, oil? And that's an open question, I guess. And I don't expect you to look into your crystal ball here on that, but I think it's something interesting to watch. You brought up a minute ago about being able to track and monitor what's going on with the different minerals that are being extracted throughout the process of building a battery. And one of the things that you talk about in your report is battery labeling, in particular an eco label. Can you tell us a little bit about, first off, what is an eco label?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different forms of battery labeling. The idea here is that we want to have strong standards in place. We also want to be able to recycle batteries at the end of their life. And labeling is a way to make information accessible to consumers, to mechanics, to vehicle dismantlers, to recyclers and repurposers, so that they can participate in this circular supply chain, right? So an eco label is a specific type of label that's a little bit more geared at consumers. And examples of existing eco labels are Energy Star labels for appliances, where consumers can see how energy efficient a refrigerator or a washer or dryer or something like that they're buying is, or a LEED standard for a building, which gives a building a grade based on how efficiently it uses energy and water and protects occupant health. So this is just communicating information about the product to consumers so that they can make the choice about the kind of product that they want to invest in. And then this can be used for a battery, like an eco label could indicate certain material sourcing standards that were adhered to, or mining practices that were used, workforce protections that were put in place, different data like that. And the US government, or sorry, not the US government, because the US government, I guess, has put new clean vehicle tax credits in place through the new climate law, and automakers want to make sure that consumers can access those tax credits, they are starting to track a lot of the information that would be necessary to be able to put into these labeling systems. And so since we're seeing this information starting to get tracked, I think the eco label will be more about, again, just like making sure that information is communicated to the folks that can benefit from it.
So when I think about labels, one of the labels that come to my mind is organic, which is a label that has been used in the food system for many years and is often very misunderstood or misused. And I wonder, could you talk a little bit about some of the risks associated with eco-labeling? Battery industry is a global industry. We're going to have minerals from lots of different countries. Some of them are not friendly to the United States. I'd love to understand a little bit more about how, eco-labeling could be done in a way that we could really trust, what the label says.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And part of that just has to do with the scheme that is governing the eco label and how products get approved for that label, how often that they have to prove that they are still compliant, whether it's on an ongoing basis, which is ideally what you have. And then also items like having a tiered system that people can comply with can help incentivize people to participate in the label and also give the label some more flexibility when you're grading it. So those are some like strategies specifically with the label. One thing in terms of like governing bodies is that the EPA was actually tasked with and giving funding to provide labeling guidelines. It's a little less on the eco labeling side and a little bit more towards like labeling more about the chemistry and the design of the battery. But through the climate law, they have funding to do so, and they are required to provide labeling guidelines. They also sponsor like certain eco labels, like EPEAT is an eco label that they sponsor for other products. And so having this like tie to a regulator can maybe help with some of these issues that you might see with like other eco labels too, just having more strict monitoring and stronger guidelines.
So are there other examples, or are there examples of like similar practices where these labels have been put into place? I brought up organic just because I've been frustrated with, how that label has been misused. Another one that we see a lot in the food space is natural or all natural ingredients, which is like totally means nothing. There's a really funny guy on Instagram that rebrands products by using rebrands Coke or other things that are considered to be unhealthy and rebrands them using these kinds of labels and misuses the labels, obviously. And so the other examples where, the battery industry can learn how to do this right.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's a little tricky with the battery industry, but I think this goes to show that in addition to eco labels, you're also going to need stronger standards to accompany those that provide a little bit more of a mechanism for enforcement that also can communicate this information to other more technical experts besides just consumers. But yeah, there always is a risk of that sort of greenwashing of what you're using. And yeah, definitely acknowledge that and just want to make sure that we're using other methods too, besides like consumer facing information to make sure that this is happening, regardless of what maybe any misinformation that people might be receiving.
A big focus, I think, of both in your report and in the discussion of batteries these days is on the recyclability of the batteries. Clearly, the materials themselves can be reused and reused over and over again. The process in which that recycling takes place has to be cost effective for it to actually come to fruition, of course. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more from your perspective about what is the battery state of play. There's some companies out there who've made a lot of noise about how they're going to be these big battery recyclers. There is a recycling industry in the United States already. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about, who you see to be some of the key players are. Is it going to be new entrants like the companies that get the headlines, or are the existing recyclers going to come online and step up and take on this big challenge?
Yeah, so one thing that's great is that we do have like you mentioned, we do have the technology today in the US to recycle batteries at commercial scale and recover around up to 95% of the minerals that are in those batteries. Some of these are new players, like you mentioned. So Redwood Materials, they have a facility in Nevada where they are recovering minerals from batteries right now. There are other newer players like LI Cycle that are building out and expanding facilities in New York. And then there are folks that have already been existing in the battery recycling industry and other recycling industries for a little bit longer, like Surface Solutions is currently expanding one of their facilities in Ohio to be able to process lithium-ion EV batteries with these high recovery technologies as well. Another place that I think you'll see existing actors is on this collection standpoint, especially throughout communities. So places where like vehicle dismantlers or scrapyards where they're getting old vehicles, like those will also be a really important link in making sure that you're collecting these vehicles and that they're then getting it to a place where the battery can be tested, could be reused, could be recycled. So they'll also be an existing actor that will be a major link here to make sure this is happening.
I've seen some like really basic videos online of what it means to recycle a battery. Can you help the audience understand what you mean by 95% of materials can be reused? What does that mean in practical sense? Like the battery we have in our phone is made up a lot of things. Is it 95% of that battery itself is going to be reused, or is it just a portion of the battery?
So yeah, some of the packaging materials that kind of hold it together. Those, may or may not be recovered depending on what they're made of. But in terms of like the minerals, those can be recovered at higher rates now that technologies like pyrohydro are being used to be able to basically like use multiple stages of processing to recover more and more of these minerals and make sure those are actually like ending up in a solution and then being precipitated out. And as simple terms, I will not try to pretend I know any more chemistry than that. Yeah. But okay. And like older processes like just plain old pyro, they don't allow for recovery of certain minerals like lithium. And so it's just important that we're making sure that we're using those most efficient processes that do exist today. So I'm not too concerned about it, but that's just one thing to flag is that older technologies don't allow for as much recovery as some of today's do.
Right on. I've heard some folks compare what's necessary for vehicle batteries for an EV with the 12-volt batteries that are already being recycled at large scale in the batteries that help start your car, or if you have a combustion engine vehicle. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And is there lessons we can learn from some of the challenges we face with recycling large lithium-ion vehicle batteries with what we're already doing with the 12-volt batteries?
Yes, definitely. So lead-acid batteries provide both a cautionary tale, but also a reason for hope and a lot of lessons that on both ends that we can learn from them and apply those to lithium-ion EV batteries today. So starting with the cautionary part is that the physical process of recycling lead-acid batteries has harmed the health of communities and ecosystems that are around those plants, especially in environmental justice communities. So this has been a really big problem, and we have to make sure that we're not repeating this with lithium-ion batteries. Fortunately,
why is that happening though? I guess.
Yes, like, great question. So fortunately, lithium-ion batteries do not contain lead. And part of the problem with lead, right, is that like it is so toxic even in really small amounts. So you're not going to have that same problem with lithium-ion technologies, but we still have to make sure that we're paying more attention and that, state EPA branches are actually monitoring the releases from these facilities to make sure that nothing is coming out in wastewater or through air pollution or other physical releases in amounts that are particularly harmful to the environment and the communities around it. So that's definitely a lesson that we can learn from these batteries. The good news is that we're not dealing with lead. Some of these materials can definitely still be harmful, but lead is definitely one of like the really, really bad actors. So that's the good news here. There are some third-party studies that are starting to be in the works, and we definitely want to see more of those that evaluate data from these plants as they're being expanded and built out to make sure that there aren't any sort of unforeseen harms with lithium-ion batteries that we didn't anticipate ahead of time. And the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts and also other toxics regulations and legislations that exist are good tools for enforcing this monitoring and making sure there's no leakage. But we have to make sure that the monitoring and the enforcement is actually happening.
I wanted to ask about that too. There's a tendency sometimes in new industries to sort of a race to the bottom where you can try to deregulate your way to profitability at the expense of local communities or even local economies. And so I wonder, it sounds like you're saying that in this case, the federal laws in place, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, can help ensure that we won't actually experience that kind of race to the bottom risk.
Yes, and so that's how the alarm bells were sounded about the lead acid recycling process in the first place, and that's how those rules ended up being enforced. And so I think the lesson that we can really take away from this particular issue with lead acid batteries is to make sure that this is being monitored and enforced from the start, and not like later because of community activism, right? So the tools are there, just making sure they're being used.
Okay.
On the positive note, like a good lesson that I think we can take away from the lead acid batteries is that they have a wildly successful collection rate for recycling. So over 99% of lead acid batteries are recovered to be recycled, which is higher than any other product in the US, right? And there are several regulations that helped incentivize and enable this collection success story that we can directly apply to lithium ion batteries. And it won't be a like 100% one for one, because like you said, with lead acid batteries, these go into combustion vehicles. Vehicle owners can really easily kind of pop those out of their vehicle themselves, versus like an EV battery. It's a lot bigger. It's much more integrated into the vehicle. Like a vehicle owner is just not going to be able to pop that out themselves. So you're going to have to play around a little bit with like the incentive structure and take into account like the different actors and who is ending up with these batteries and vehicles. But the regulatory structure, I think, is definitely something that we should learn from. And that was super successful for collecting these batteries for recycling.
Speaking of rules and regulations, back at the top, we were talking about how, we're in a place where environmental NGOs have to talk about resource extraction in how necessary it is in order to reduce emissions, which can sound somewhat counterintuitive to people if they don't know much about the topic. One of the ongoing challenges with this resource extraction, at least in the United States, is the law in place for mining and minerals is, let's say, very old and out of date. I'm hoping you could tell the audience a little bit about that and why it needs to be up to date, why it needs to be updated, and what are some of the reforms that you all recommend take place once Congress does get off the dime there.
Yes. So, those are adjectives I would choose to use as well. For folks that are not aware, the law that currently governs mining in the U.S. was signed in 1872, and it is over 150 years old. And so, as you might imagine, the list of must-haves for mining reform isn't the shortest. And one thing I like to a way to contextualize this issue is that mineral mining has obviously been an issue because the mining laws and regulations are so old. It's been an issue for decades, and communities and NGOs and tribes have all been advocating for strong mining reform for decades, right? And now that EVs, which are a green technology, are reliant on this harmful industry, there's really just been a big spotlight on this issue, which I think we should be able to use to our benefit to actually implement these asks that have been around for a really long time and reform this industry as a whole, which isn't just to serve EVs, right? Like we have lots of ongoing mining, and if there's no EVs made tomorrow, we would still have a lot of mining and issues going on. So that's kind of how I like to think about this as an opportunity to really put some emphasis and timeliness on this need for mining reform, which is much overdue. In terms of those top must-haves, I'll keep it to about 3 or so to keep it a little on the shorter end. But one is definitely, I think that we really need to look at siting as a tool for limiting impacts. So what I mean by that is thinking about where we're putting mines and making sure that if a mine should not exist on a land that is a really sensitive ecosystem. It has, a lot of ability to impact water supply downstream, or it is necessary or sacred to a nearby indigenous population. So thinking about siting as a tool and actually really emphasizing that in regulatory processes and permitting processes, I think is really important. A second thing that is really needed is more community engagement early and often to make sure that people have input on the project. And this can also help with the siting issue, but it can also there's a lot of evidence that it makes permitting times actually go down because you've gotten this input earlier instead of you've already planned the project and now you're just presenting it. And obviously people aren't going to like that if they didn't have input. So that's the second thing. And then the third that I'll say for now is compensation for taxpayers, because right now most extractive industries pay a royalty fee when they mine on and extract materials on public lands, and mineral mining companies do not. So that's another thing that we're really looking for in mining reform. And there's much more, but I'll keep it there for today.
Okay. A big part of your report we haven't talked about yet, excuse me. It's right there in the subtitle, doing the best with less. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so what I mean by that is we're talking about these two parallel actions really that we need to make sure that we're minimizing the impact of our transition to EVs. That's very necessary. So that first thing is doing better, is bringing mining practices into the 21st century and making sure that when we're getting these resources out of the ground, they cause as the little amount of harms as possible. And that second part is making sure that we're doing this with less minerals. So making sure that we're employing strategies to use less minerals while we're still electrifying our transportation system. So to make vehicles more efficient, newer battery technologies that can get people places where they need to go while we're still using less of these. Because at the end of the day, the least harmful mine is one that was never built. But we really have to transform our transportation system now, because the current fossil fuel status quo is a no-go. So that's what I mean by doing the best with less.
Yeah. Well, I guess I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about some of the strategies that you put in the report around doing more with less. Speak a little to the role of the federal government. You mentioned what you're calling the climate law. We normally call it IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. Also, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA. Both of those laws have programs in place that can help here, I think. So could you talk a little bit about what you see as the role of the federal government in helping do more with less?
Yeah, definitely. So the federal government already has a lot of authority to help make a lot of these things happen, especially at the agency level. And like you said, there's a lot of funding opportunities right now through these new laws that can help support this industry as it's growing. One thing that we definitely want to see from these investments is to make sure they're focusing more on the reuse and recycling pieces. Right now, they're pretty forward focused on the mineral processing, which is also really important. But we want to make sure, again, that we can reuse these minerals again and again, so we don't have to keep taking more out of the ground. So guiding more of those investments, which are eligible to be going towards recycling and reuse towards those things, is really important. And then on the agency level, agencies like the Department of Interior have the authority to regulate mining and permitting practices on their lands. So making sure that we're updating those regulations. And then the EPA has authority over recycling. So they have the ability to start to help make sure that the recycling for these batteries is happening. Like I mentioned earlier, they also have authority for labeling, things like that. So I think the thing that the federal government can do is to look into where their existing authority lies to really help with this and to really guide the investments that they already have the authority to give towards the areas that need it the most and can help really clean up these systems.
Yeah, I think back to this map that we were showing just a few minutes ago of where extraction is happening, and it's widespread. It's all over the country. It's blue states and red states. It's every corner essentially has some representation here. So this is something that everybody should be paying attention to. So I really appreciate you coming on the show, Jordan, and sharing your perspective and your great report. You can download the report at NRDC's website. It's free, of course, as is all work from your great organization. So thanks again for joining us, Jordan. And this brings us to the end of our episode on batteries. We'll be back again, likely next month, with another topic for EV Hub Live. Thanks again for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick, for having me.